my best chocolate cake recipe. I'm so excited to share this one with you. It's ultra moist and fudgy, loaded with chocolate flavor, but the best part is it won't sink in the middle like a lot of other chocolate cake recipes. My name is Tessa and I'm from handletoheat.com, where I love to share sweet treats with a sprinkling of baking science, and be sure to watch this video all the way to the end for my best cake tips and tricks. Now for this recipe, we're actually gonna get started with the chocolate ingredients. So in my bowl here, my heat-proof bowl, I have bittersweet chocolate, and to that I'm adding Dutch processed cocoa powder. Now I've tested this recipe with both Dutch processed and regular cocoa powder, and I just find Dutch processed adds such a beautiful, deep chocolate color and flavor. It's definitely my favorite, and nowadays you can find it at many grocery stores. So I'm going to add that in to my chocolate, and then a little bit of espresso powder. Now, if you don't have espresso powder, you can either leave it out, or the next ingredient is actually boiling water. You could use hot coffee, strong coffee, instead of water if you didn't have the espresso powder. So I'm just going to pour this water all over this mixture, and it just came off the kettle, so it's nice and hot, and that's going to melt this whole mixture down. I'm going to cover it to help keep the heat in, and let that sit for about 5 minutes or until it's all nice and melted. Okay, so this should be all melted down, so I'm just going to give it a stir and make it nice and smooth. Okay, then I'll set this aside to let it finish cooling while I mix together my dry ingredients. All right, so I have my flour in my bowl here, and to that I'm going to add granulated sugar and brown sugar. And I love to use brown sugar in this recipe for the extra flavor and moisture it gives. You'll see that when these cakes bake up, they almost look like a big brownie with a shiny crust on top. They're amazing. I'm also going to add baking soda and a little bit of salt. Now, this recipe doesn't involve any butter, so there's no creaming of the butter and sugar, which is why we're adding the sugar in with these dry ingredients. We're actually using vegetable oil in this recipe and sour cream. Okay, so this is all mixed up, so I'm going to move on to my other wet ingredients. So in my bowl, I'm going to add some sour cream, vegetable oil, and you want to make sure to give your vegetable oil a little sniff test and make sure it doesn't smell off or like it's gone rancid, otherwise it will ruin your whole cake. You want to use fresh vegetable oil. And then I'm using 4 large eggs and 1 egg yolk, and I'm using that extra egg yolk for chewiness and richness and to make sure this cake turns out really moist and tender. Now, when you're making cake, you always want your eggs to be at room temperature so that they add into the mixture nicely. Now I'm adding a tablespoon of white plain vinegar, which I know kind of sounds like a weird ingredient, but that's what's going to help activate the baking soda in this recipe, so that our cake is nice and light and fluffy. And lastly, a touch of vanilla extract. Now I'm going to whisk this together until it's nice and combined. So how simple is this cake batter? There's no mixer involved, so now I've got my 3 basic components. I'm just gonna combine them together. So into my wet ingredients, I'm going to add that melted chocolate mixture. It's cooled down. You wanna make sure it's completely cool so you don't scramble the eggs in this recipe. And I can smell the espresso powder. The coffee or espresso powder, whichever one you use, just really enhances the chocolate flavor in this recipe. So I'm going to give this a quick stir. And then I'm going to add in my dry ingredient mixture. I'm going to do half at a time so that I can make sure all incorporates evenly. Okay, and then just keep stirring until it's all incorporated. And you wanna make sure not to over-mix the batter here, otherwise you'll end up with a cake that's more dense or rubbery, which we don't want. If there are a couple lumps in the batter, that's definitely better than having a dense or dry cake. Okay, and that's it for the batter. All right, so I have 2 8-inch cake pans here. Never use dark coated cake pans when you're making a cake because they will actually cook faster than lighter colored pans. And with your chocolate cake, you really don't want to have those edges getting crispy or overly browned or burnt. So use lighter colored pans, and I'm actually going to layer them. I have an 8-inch circle of parchment paper, which I just cut out, and I'm going to take a little bit of this very soft butter and grease the pan completely. You really want to be sure you're greasing the pan very well. We don't want the cake to stick at all. There's nothing more frustrating than working really hard on a brand new cake and then having it totally ruined because it got stuck to the pan. Okay, so now I can actually pour the batter into the pans. And if you have a kitchen scale and you want to get really precise, you can actually measure the volume of batter that you're putting into each pan to make sure they're perfectly evenly distributed between the two pans. But today I'm just going to eyeball it. So these will go in a 350-degree oven for about 35 to 40 minutes or until a cake tester inserted into the center comes out nice and clean. So my chocolate cakes have baked and cooled completely. You want to make sure that there's no warmth left to them before you frost it. Now I've already leveled one cake off. Let me show you how I do that. I like to use this Wilton cake leveler. If you don't have one of these, you can also just use a serrated knife, but this makes it way quicker and easier and it's perfectly precise. I'll be sure to link to one of these down below. So what you do is you just find the level that you want your cake to be at, and then you just put your hand on top and run the wire through the cake. And this basically just helps to make sure that the cake is perfectly flat so that when we go to frost it, it looks beautiful and professional. If you don't care so much about that, you can totally skip this step though. Okay, so I've got my cake assembly set up all ready to go. I went ahead and put one of the layers of cakes on a little cardboard cake cutout. You can get these at Michael's or Hobby Lobby or anywhere like that. It just helps to make the cake more sturdy and then you can transport it more easily too. So I'm going to put just a little bit of frosting on my cake platter, and that will kind of act as spackle and help keep the cake in place and not slide around. Now I'm using a movable turntable. You don't need one of these, but again, if you do make a lot of cakes, it's worth it because it makes it so much easier. I'll go ahead and link to that down below. So I'm just going to top my cake with some of my Swiss meringue buttercream. This is my favorite frosting for this recipe, and I have a whole other video on how to make it. I have actually a ton of buttercream videos and recipes. I'll be sure to link them all down below. I'm just going to spread this evenly across my first layer of cake. An offset spatula is your best friend when you're frosting a cake. It makes it way quick and easy to get beautiful frosting. Now the nice thing about working with Swiss meringue buttercream is that you don't really need a crumb coat because the buttercream is so smooth and creamy. If you're using American buttercream, which is a little bit heavier, then you'll want to use a crumb coat first. And I have a whole other video on how to assemble a cake using American buttercream, and I'll link to that as well. Okay, so I'm almost done with this first layer. You want to make sure to push the buttercream all the way to the edges so that you don't have any gaps in between the two layers of your cake. Okay, so now it's time to top it with the second layer of cake. Now, for the top layer, I usually like to do it bottom side up so that it's perfectly flat on top and you have a really great surface to work with for the top of your cake. And we're just going to keep frosting until it's all frosted and beautiful and ready to eat. Okay, now I'm going to use my offset spatula and start to frost the sides of the cake. It might feel a little bit awkward at first, frosting a cake if you're not experienced with it, but just keep moving the frosting around until it looks pretty. And you can decorate it with sprinkles or use a piping tip and make decorative frosting designs on top, whatever your heart desires. Sometimes a bigger spatula makes quicker and easier work, but whatever you do, an offset spatula is definitely the best tool. Okay, so to finish the cake off, I'm just going to smooth off the top and the sides a little bit. You definitely don't have to worry about it being perfect. I like my cakes to be delicious, so if it's not actually perfect looking, it's not that big of a deal because it's going to taste so good. Your friends and family are going to love this recipe. If you want, you can use your spatula to give little swirls, just to give it a little bit of a flair, or you could go all out and do piping or whatever your heart desires. Now, once you're done frosting, I just like to use a little wet paper towel to wipe down the edges if you're frosting on the platter that you plan on serving the cake on, just so it's nice and neat and pretty. All right, and there you have it, my best chocolate cake. You guys are going to love this recipe. Your friends and family are gonna go crazy. If you do give this recipe a try, be sure to let me know how it goes in the comments below, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. If you did like this video, then be sure to subscribe as well, and I will see you in a new baking video soon.